Hi everyone. Today, lesson three, we're looking at different ways, different tools, I should say, to help us classify organisms. So earlier we learned about dichotomous key. It's a very simple system for classifying organisms, so putting them into groups, as we talked about previously. Phylogeny and modern taxonomy, these take into account way more than just the physical characteristics. So things like DNA analysis, things like evolutionary data. It takes into consideration all of those types of things, and it's very much a more precise method. Whereas hopefully you saw with the dichotomous key, there's some room for error. So if, for example, you use color in a dichotomous key, you and I might disagree on the color, and then that might affect all of the results that we get. So these phylogeny and modern taxonomic tools, they are much more precise, and we're going to get a little bit of practice with them today. You'll notice in the lab there's something about reflecting upon dichotomous key versus phylogenetic tree. So we're going to go over what that is to help you with answering lab number one questions. So starting us off here, a little bit about the theory of evolution. And I had mentioned to you in the last lessons that we do have a whole unit on evolution. So we're only really scratching the surface in this unit, but we will go into more information about this topic later on. But just in a broad sense, evolution, or the theory of evolution, I should say, describes changes in species over time, as well as their shared ancestry. And I'm going to show you on the next slide what I mean by that. If we think of families when we talk about ancestry, we think about ancestors that came long ago, leading up to modern day ourselves, right? Who's around still right now. So a similar concept as that, but now we're talking about species and how they evolved from some ancestor previously. So biologists describe relatedness between different species as closely or distantly related. So an example would be, we talked a few days ago about the polar bear and the black bear. They were part of what we called the same genus. We would call those pretty closely related. Now, if you took a polar bear and you compared it to, let's say, a whale, where there's way more differences, you would call that more distantly related. So we'll see some examples of that and how we use that in our tool. So I was mentioning previously, thinking of a family. So we have this new term here, phylogeny. And phylogeny is studying how things are related. So I was mentioning those terms before, closely related versus distantly related. So for example, in this family tree, which I'm sure you've seen some version of this before, we have two people here who are siblings. They are very closely related. They share the two same parents. But as we move down the tree into these people, they become more distantly related from one another. So if I took this child and compared him with this child, they have more differences, for example, in their DNA. So that would be a significant difference. Now, we're doing that here not with people within the same species. These people are all human, so they're all within the same species. What we're going to be moving in to use this for is actually looking at different species. So comparing things like if I took, for example, a bacteria and I wanted to find its relatedness to a human, right? Those are clearly very distantly related. So that's what we're working on with phylogeny. I find the family tree example just useful because that's something familiar to us, but these people are all within the same species. So they are all related in that sense, but we use a similar concept with phylogeny. So here is really where the tool part comes in. This tool is called a phylogenetic tree, excuse me. And this is a branching diagram similar to the family tree, except now we're looking at different species. Okay, so I'm going to point out a few things to you on the next couple of slides, things that we use this for. So I mentioned before relationships. We're thinking about, are they closely related or are they distantly related? And similar to the family tree, the farther apart they are typically means the more distantly related. So in this one over here in part A, we have a fish over here, and then way over here, a human. So that shows a large difference. So distantly related, we would phrase that as. Over here, we see a cat and a human are very close to each other, or in other words, closely related. Okay. Now, we do use this concept of ancestry. So similar to how on the family tree we had older generations, here we have older types of species. And I'm going to show you on the next slide, but at each of these, what we call nodes or points where these meet, there was an ancestor that's common. So for the cat and the human, there was a recent ancestor right here who was shared between both the cat and the human. So it becomes really interesting when we look at that, because what scientists are trying to do is trace it all the way back to the very first form of life, which is very difficult to do. So we're going to talk about some theories surrounded by that. As I mentioned previously, most evidence here is really from looking not only at physical traits, but also at DNA analysis. And in Unit 2, we deal with the DNA analysis part. We'll talk about sort of similarities between different organisms and so on. But that's how a scientist would put this together. And we're going to see some examples of how we use that later on. So this diagram is just the same one, but flipped onto its side. And now we have letters in place. So a couple of things I want to just define, which are on this diagram. Something called a most recent common ancestor. And we can see that the most recent organism that evolved into modern day species. So that's represented right here. So as I said with my example with the human and the cat, it has a very recent common ancestor. And when I say recent, I'm talking about timelines. So this could be millions of years. This is not necessarily like recent in terms of like 10 years ago. But if we look at sort of this time frame, the ancestors are shown farther back. The modern or present day species are shown at the end of the diagram, at the end of the tree. So we're essentially looking at a timeline. If I wanted to compare organism A and D, let's say, I would have to go tracing all the way back to right here. That would be the most recent common ancestor of organism A and D. Okay, so these organisms at the nodes, they are extinct. They no longer exist. They're not on Earth anymore. The ones that are on Earth now are these guys, these A through E. Okay, that's what we call a modern day species or present day species. So this is in the form that we see them walking and actually living on Earth today. The ones at these nodes, they're no longer around. They're what we call the ancestors. Okay, so going on from there, there is an additional thing we can use these for, which is called clades. And a clade is essentially a grouping of organisms that includes the common ancestor as well as all descendants of that ancestor. So it can be very small, including just a couple of species, or it can be very large. So I'll show you a couple of examples of that next. So here is an example. Now this one actually has some additional info on it as well, which is along the side here. These are traits that developed over time. And you'll notice that actually this one is shaped a little bit differently. It means the same thing. So where we have nodes on here would be like at these little corners. Okay, so again, those meeting points represent common ancestors. So an example here of what we might be asked to do is to outline a clade. That's a very common example. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. I just put a little example here. Determine the smallest clade that includes the blank and the blank. So these are the type of things that you'd be asked to do. And so I'm going to show you, I'll just have to switch screens for a quick sec. I'm going to show you an example of that. So let's say that I wanted the smallest clade that includes, I'm going to just choose two of these organisms, the tuna and the turtle. Okay, Just a really quick reminder, a clade is a common ancestor, most recent common ancestor, excuse me, as well as all of its descendants. So what I'm talking about comparing is the tuna and the turtle. Now, when I trace back and look for the node, it would be this node right here. So this is the most recent common ancestor of those two organisms. So when I'm drawing the clade, what I'm really trying to do is actually highlight or group that most recent common ancestor as well as all of its descendants. So everything that came from that ancestor. So what I do is highlight it like this. So this represents a clade, the smallest clade that includes the tuna and the leopard and the turtle, excuse me. Now I want to show you a wrong example that some people get it wrong. They just outline it almost like this, and they say, I'm going to chop off the leopard. The leopard is not part of this clade. Well, that is incorrect because in fact, the leopard is a descendant of this recent ancestor. Okay, so it's really important that that leopard is included. I'm going to just erase for a second. It is really important that that leopard is also included. So this would be the smallest possible clade. And you can do this with any of the different combinations. Okay, I'm going to do a second example here just to show you. Let's say instead of tuna and turtle, I wanted something different now. Let's say that I wanted the lamprey and the salamander. You can choose any combination, doesn't really matter. And I want the smallest clade. Okay, so I go to my diagram and I want to first find their most recent common ancestor. And that would be right here. Okay, I'm going to just short form it, most recent common ancestor of those two, of the lamprey and the salamander. Then I'm going to take out my highlighter and I'm going to say, okay, here's the clade. And then I want to outline and sort of show that it includes not only the lamprey and salamander, but also all other descendants like these guys. So I can't just box in the two that I want, I have to include all descendants. Okay, so I'm going to jump back over here. You're going to do some practice with this on your own as well. You're going to read a small textbook section with it, which is right here. So I have linked for you is I want you to read a little textbook passage. It's essentially doing what I just did there. And I want you to actually look at some other examples and try them on your own. I've just added on here a little reflection on D2L. So you're going to find this within the discussion topics under lesson 3. I want you to think about the strengths and weaknesses of traditional systems, such as using physical traits. That would be like our dichotomous key, versus the phylogenetic classification, which is what we're doing here with these phylogenetic trees, which I mentioned they include genetics and evolution as part of what organizes that entire tree. And then it's really your opinion. So which one do you think is more effective and why? So at this point, you will have tried out the dichotomous key and also tried out a bit of the phylogenetic tree. And your goal is to try to figure out for yourself, which one do you think is actually better in helping to classify everything?